Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry.
And I'm Annie Berglund. Sam, Unit 3 just flies by. We're already halfway through it. Do you have any advice at all for the students?
Yeah, I think because it flies by, it means that, for one thing, it's really important that as you're going through the museums, the movies, things like this, that you're also paying attention to the vocabulary. You're writing that stuff out. You're prepping that for the exam. It's funny, if you look at the first unit of this course, I think it takes about 2 weeks. This one takes about a week, so it's a lot shorter. There's still a lot of content and a lot of reading, but it's compressed a little bit. So it's just 2 movies and 2 museums and 2 webisodes to go through all of it. So make sure you're thinking about prepping for the exam from the very beginning. If you haven't been working on writing out vocab and things like that, today's a good day to sort of do a little bit of catch up on that stuff to make sure you're ready to go for the exam. Annie, we've been talking about the scientific revolution. And if you had to pick just one scientific revolution reading that you want students to master, which one is it and why is it Galileo?
I love that you chose it for me. Galileo's reading is emblematic of the shift of the scientific revolution, this elevation of the scientific method in order to find and evaluate and predict truth. And also the idea that science is gradually replacing religion or faith as the ultimate source or the first source of authority for answering a lot of these things, especially about the natural world. And so Galileo's reading, though, is an interesting one, kind of in the middle, saying, science doesn't have to replace faith or the Bible, but both are really important to different ends, to different means, and in different ways of understanding God's truth and God's creation. And so I think his reading is especially important for us to understand for Unit 3, because he's really holding that tension, just like Pascal's reading as well. They're both kind of these maybe hinge figures or figures that are existing in transition. There are these people that are saying, okay, we have this tension between science and reason and also our faith and the Bible. How do we evaluate both of those and hold them up at the same time, using them to find truth and using them to God's glory? And so for Galileo's reading, he's facing allegations from the church over his observations. He's on trial. And essentially what he's saying is like, look, people who are arguing against my scientific observations are using the Bible in order to argue against them. They're using the Bible as a science textbook, and that's not what the Bible is. That's not why it was written. And so he speaks pretty clearly about how this ignores allegory. It ignores literary devices, because the Bible is something like scripture is something written. It's something written by real human authors. And so they're including these different types of devices and methods, and that the church has been misusing the Bible for something that it's not. It's not about the planets. It's not about biology or chemistry. It's about the matters of the heart. It's about salvation. It's about God's love for humanity. And so, in some ways, this is saying like, look, Plato and Aristotle, like, they were wrong about the universe too, but the church is also wrong in using scripture to defend antiquated notions of the natural world. And so instead, we need to gain knowledge from using method in order to understand the world around us. And so I think that it's important because he's looking into how we interpret the Bible, basically saying like, look, if you're a theologian, that's great. You understand scripture. But stay in your lane. That doesn't mean that you are also a scientist, And so like these two avenues are not necessarily in contradiction with one another, but they both have experts that we should value and trust as sources of authority in those matters. So I think it's a really important text for us in Unit 3. Sam, if you had to just pick one scientific revolution reading that you'd want students to master, what is it, and why is it Pascal's reading?
Well, Pascal is one of my favorite readings we do in this course, and I think he's a little complicated. I think we have to really pay attention to what he's saying and pay attention to his context, because as you point out, he is living in this sort of liminal space, this gray area, as the world around him is changing. And he's aware of that change, and he's projecting out where that change might go. So really, in some ways, it's almost like he's giving advice to people in the next couple generations who are going to be continuing to wrestle with the scientific revolution, and then wrestling with the Enlightenment. And I think part of the context is thinking about someone like Descartes. So Descartes is a fellow French philosopher, mathematician, and Christian who, Descartes' solution to this sort of rise in the sciences, this rise of reason as the real currency of intellectual discourse, is to say, well, what we need to do is take faith and raise it to the standard of reason. We need to turn faith into reason, because Descartes' going to say faith isn't good enough. Right? It's not good enough if you're talking to somebody who doesn't already have faith. The language of faith isn't going to matter to try to bring them to the truth of Christianity. So he says we need to turn faith into reason. Now, Pascal is looking at that and he's thinking there's a lot of danger in that, because by turning the things we hold on faith into things that we can understand with our reason, there's a chance that we're killing the very thing we're trying to save. So instead, Pascal lays out this program, and I think this is helpful to this day for people of faith, right? Where he's talking about faith and reason and how those things need to interact. Now, this is a question we've seen people talk about from the very beginnings of Christianity. Back in the early church, we were talking about Tertullian and Augustine talking about faith and reason in different ways. Aquinas talks about faith and reason. Galileo talks about faith and reason. Pascal has an interesting way to think about it, because he says, reason is a way of knowing, but faith is also a way of knowing, right? He says that if we make our religion only about reason, like Descartes wants to do, we strip away anything that is mysterious or supernatural, right? We strip it of its power. We kill the thing we're trying to save by making it rational. At the same time, if we abandon reason, then there is no mooring for our faith, right? He says we are rational creatures. So to have a faith in something that lacks any connection to reason denies that part of humanity. And it's sort of like, then religion just becomes absurd, because it becomes anything, right? So he says we need both of these things, and they're both ways of knowing. He says we know things in our head, right? Reason exists in our head. We know things in our mind. We know it. It's a way of knowing. But he says we also feel things in our heart. And he says there are things we feel in our heart that the head will never understand. So he's making the case that this heart feeling is really another kind of knowledge, another way of knowing. There's the way of faith in the heart and the way of reason in the mind. And he says this line that the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know what to make of. So he says that this is just another way of knowing. And the answer to how we think about faith and reason is we look at both of them as different kinds of knowledge. And we need to think about how those types of knowledge are going to inform each other. And I think that's a really powerful reading, because he says if we lack either of those, we don't get the full scope of being human, and we don't get the full scope of what Christianity is and what religion is and what religion should be. So I think that's a really, really powerful reading, and I think it's a helpful tool. I found it helpful in my own life as I've sort of faced questions, is to go back to someone like Pascal. Annie, you and I are both humanities types, both historians. We often try to convince science majors and other students that they should study things like history and philosophy and literature and things like that. But let's flip that around. Why should humanities type folks, non-science students, why should they be interested in fields like biology and chemistry and physics?
I think the answer can be quite simple, in that people in different disciplines study and do things differently, right? Like we're interested in different questions of research. We're interested in different investigative processes. We write things up in different forms and we publish them in different journals, right? And so all these different disciplines have these different avenues for explaining the truth that they find in the world. And it's up to us to be able to understand the language of those different disciplines. Like that's why we even have, like, you could get a master's or go to graduate school for science communication, being able to communicate these scientific findings to larger groups of people, right? In order to inform policy, for instance, or in order to inform the public on what they can do to help a certain situation. And so that's why we need it, because all of these are such different paths. And I think it's important for people in the humanities to study the sciences and vice versa, because what's the saying? It's like, if we only use a hammer, we start to see everything as being a nail. Like every solution is just pounding a nail in with a hammer, right? But instead, we need to start seeing these problems as potentially being very different. And sometimes we can't do that through our own disciplines. Sometimes we need something else. So for instance, like with COVID-19, with the pandemic, like interdisciplinary work was really so important and necessary at that time. Like, we needed sociologists and political scientists and historians to go back and look at how we've worked through pandemics in the past, what policies worked, what didn't work, how those are impacting different populations. We need sociologists for that as well. But we also need scientists to be able to come and say, like, well, here's where the technology has advanced. We needed philosophers to look at things ethically and decide how we distribute, how we, what we should require of people, and how we can better service our whole planet. And so I think all of these skills are really important. Studying sciences for me has made me a better historian and a better citizen, and ultimately just challenges me to see beyond my one lens, my one way of doing things. So that's my argument for the
So basically, you're making the case for a good liberal arts major that you could get at a place like Bethel University, right?
Exactly. Perfect.
All right,
exactly
students.
What I did.
That's right. Students, for our last Poodle response video, which is due tomorrow at 10, we want you to reflect on your own experience with science classes. Now, some of you, your major is in the sciences, some of you not. So I'm really curious to hear this. So due tomorrow at 10 a.m. That's what you're going to be doing for your video. For myself, I'll sort of give you my video right now. When I first came to Bethel, I was a computer science major, so I actually have a big background in math and science, particularly, and that was really informative to me. And coming to a place like Bethel, Annie and I are both Bethel grads. I think it's really helpful to sort of see both of those things, and I think, like Pascal said, they're both ways of knowing. So when I switched my major from a very sort of math and science major of computer science to history, I didn't give up on those things, and when I think about my teaching, I think about the intersection of sort of humanities and arts and the sciences and technology especially. And I will say I grew up, and this actually goes back to something we talked about in the Middle Ages. Because I grew up Catholic, my view of faith and science actually is shaped by someone like Thomas Aquinas. It's not that we studied Aquinas growing up directly. I didn't read a lot of Aquinas in high school, but I could see the approach of the school that I went to. I went to a Dominican high school taught by some Cincinnati Dominican nuns. And when I reflect on that, I really can see a Thomistic approach to that. This idea that Aquinas's approach is faith perfects reason. So he has this higher view of reason, that reason can teach us a lot, but it can't teach us everything, and we need to then bring in faith completes the work that reason begins. That's a big piece of how I grew up thinking about this. So I don't think I ever had the major like clash or tension between science, faith and science, where I have friends who grew up maybe more evangelical, and that was a lot and is a lot more difficult waters for them to navigate. So I think our stories sometimes impact how we view those things. So that's my story with thinking about sort of faith and science, that I think someone like Aquinas trickling down through the years really did end up informing the curriculum that I was taught growing up, and informing the way that I think about these things. And then when I got to college and read people like Pascal, like that really helped solidify and help me think about some of the tensions that other people around me were feeling, thinking about faith and science. So your students, your job now is to create your Poodle video. Let us know your story, your experience with science in high school and college. And how do you think about the relationship between your faith and the sciences? Annie, that's all the time we have for this segment. We're going to be back in segment 2 to play one last game of Make the Case and debate some big topics coming out of this first half of Unit 3. Welcome back. We are now going to play a game of Make the Case. So we have 3 topics you and I are going to debate. I have our envelopes here with our randomly selected answers. So Annie, let's jump into the first one. First question, true or false? Isaac Newton is the single most important person we talk about in this course. Which envelope do you want?
Right this time. You're right.
My right. All right,
Yes.
That is yours. And you will be arguing that statement is true.
Ooh, all right. Well, I love absolute statements. Should I go first, Sam?
Absolutely.
Okay, so yes, Isaac Newton is the single most important person we talk about in this course. Why do I think that's true? Well, his publications gave us things like the universal laws of nature. We have the laws of gravity, the laws of nature. I have Sam's definition all ready to go. Sam says that the law of nature is the universal principle knowable through reason, which predicts regularity in nature. Did I hit it? Did I do it right?
You did great.
Perfect. So it's a universal principle, meaning it's true no matter what or what you are, where you are, what time it is, right? It will always continue to be. These laws of nature helped us to predict. And it's something that is we call it a paradigm shift in this class. And that's not an exaggeration. Like having Newton, the father of modern science, come up with these scientific methods in order to have a question, investigate, find regularities, and predict things in nature is important not only for our science today, but it's also important for things like the Enlightenment and expanding that beyond just science. So in fact, I would say that he's crucial for the whole rest of the unit, carrying into today in 2023. If the laws of nature exist in nature and the sciences, why can't they also exist in the political sciences or in music or in philosophy or art or economics? Like, why can't they also exist in these other disciplines and make our world a much easier place to solve problems or find truth? So I'm giving that all to Newton. I think he's one of the most important people, if not the most important person in CWC.
Well, I get to argue that this statement is false. And I will say, if I would have picked true, I think there's a degree to which I agree with you. But if I'm going to make the case that Newton's not the most important person, I need to do 2 things. I need to explain why he's not that important, and I need to make a counter case for who is the most important. So why is he not the most important? Actually, Newton's biggest problem is science and reason. Because science is rational, because there's a scientific method, it stands to reason that if you plucked Newton out of history, it might have taken us a little longer, but aren't we going to find those same answers? Isn't there an inevitability to science and reason, right? So I mean, I agree Newton is a tremendous genius, and maybe it takes us a century longer, to reach the things that Newton found, but I think there's a kind of potential inevitability to that. So I want to think about somebody where maybe there isn't that same inevitability, and I'm going to say Augustine. And the reason I'm going to pick Augustine is because of the footprint that he has going forward. I mean, Augustine shapes the church to this very day, shapes Christianity to this very day. Jim Bilby, one of the theologians here at Bethel, when he talks about Augustine and why he's important, he says that you cannot do theology, even in the 21st century, without at least acknowledging and wrestling with Augustine. You can't just dismiss him. You can't ignore him. You have to wrestle with what he does. So he has this huge theological footprint, this huge shadow that he casts, right? So I think that speaks to significance. If we're thinking about this course in particular, Christianity, Western culture, Augustine's City of God really is this monumental statement for thinking about that question, right? He's living in a post-Constantinian world. wrestling with how do Christians live in this world, be citizens of this world, but also have this citizenship in heaven. I think that sort of two kingdoms argument that Augustine makes is a really powerful one, a really important one. And again, that's going to, he has such an impact on someone like Martin Luther, but Augustine also has such an impact on someone like Thomas Aquinas. Everybody going forward in Christianity is going to be connected to Augustine. He shapes medieval theology, right? The theology of the sacraments comes out of his debate with the Donatists. Theology of salvation comes out of his debate with Pelagius. I just think his footprint is so big that that's who I would have to pick. Annie, question number 2. I'll go first on this one. Okay. The question is, Pascal wants to know which is the more important problem for Christians in the scientific age, to submit everything to reason or to offend the principles of reason. So which envelope do you want?
We'll go your left this time.
So you're taking my left, so I'm taking my right.
Mm-hmm.
And I am going to argue that the biggest problem for Christians is to submit everything to reason.
Mm.
All right. So I talked a little bit about this in segment 1 when I was talking about Pascal. Pascal is arguing that if we submit everything to reason, that our religion lacks anything mysterious or supernatural, right? It becomes only rational. And again, this gets back to his critique of Pascal. He is Pascal. His critique of Descartes, right? Descartes is trying to change faith into reason, to elevate it to that standard. But when you do that, when you say, okay, we want to understand God within the bounds of reason, there's parts of things that you associate with God within Christianity that you have to get rid of because it offends reason too much, right? So, thinking about things like the incarnation, God becoming flesh, you think about the miraculous, right? All of those things fit a scientific definition of the miraculous, where the laws of reason, the laws of nature are bent or broken, right? And that is by definition then irrational, right? So I think if we're trying to go down that path of looking only to reason, we need to get rid of those things. We need to start to say, it's almost like with Aquinas when he gives his definitions of his proofs for God's existence, right? He starts with these rational definitions, and they sort of are things like God is the creator, right? There has to be a beginning, and God is the beginning. There has to be a prime mover, a thing that set things in motion. There has to be an efficient cause, something that caused everything else without being caused itself by something else. All of those arguments argue for a beginning, a creator, something like that, but it doesn't tell you anything about that creator. And that's where Aquinas says that's where we need to bring faith in, right? Faith explains who God is, explains our relationship with God. And I think if we go down Descartes' path of trying to sort of understand religion only through reason, we have to start cutting out those things. And instead we have God as supreme being. We have God as creator, God as the beginnings. But a lot of the other stuff, a lot of the relational stuff, and a lot of the things that are core to Christianity, in my mind, we have to get rid of. And we end up then with a pretty flat understanding of religion, and a religion where you start to ask yourself, well, is this necessary? Beyond sort of a rational game of saying, well, obviously there has to be a beginning, so we're going to call that thing God, and we're going to call the recognition of that God religion. I don't know that that's much of a religion, so I think that's the bigger problem that we face. All right, Annie.
All right, offending the principles of reason, or prioritizing faith over the principle of reason. So I would think that this would be the greater obstacle for Christians to wrestle with, because it's kind of twofold. So first of all, I think we need to be able to elevate faith and reason to the same level, or a similar level at least, because in order for us to read and understand the Bible, we need to have some reason. We need to be able to look to Scripture and analyze and interpret some of that material. I mean, that is a very post-Enlightenment, post-Reformation perspective that I'm taking, but I agree wholeheartedly that we need that in order to understand what God has given us through his word. But I think another one that we see argued, especially by Descartes, is if we want to be heard by people who don't believe, we need to be able to use reason in order to explain our faith, in order to explain our perspectives, our points of view. So Descartes' concern is if we're going to communicate our faith to the multitudes, we need to make sure that that the multitudes know that we are using reason, right? So it's like in the marketplace of ideas, this requires reason. So we need to be able to use reason in order to proselytize, right? In order to make our faith understandable to people who are not Christians. Like, I think even about like, if you've ever seen a debate between a Christian scholar and a non-Christian scholar, specifically like in sciences or in the humanities, I'm not talking about theology, like a strictly theological debate, but if we're looking at a larger debate, if the Christian only points to scripture or the supernatural or faith to back up their argument, is the non-Christian scholar going to accept that proof or that evidence? Probably not. It's not going to probably be adequate. It won't be held up to what they have found. And if we really believe that scripture and reason coincide, that they're married together and that they're both serving us in finding the same truth, well, then we shouldn't be scared to use reason, just like people who aren't Christians. And so and that's not even just in terms of debate or argument, but also just in pairing up and learning from and adding to secular discourses. Christians really need to be able to use reason and philosophy and science in order to explain our beliefs and also to make them explainable to others, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. All right, last question comes from the end of the Enlightenment period, Immanuel Kant. And he talks about the big obstacles to people actually becoming enlightened. So which is the bigger obstacle, cowardice or laziness? You're going to go first on this one.
This one's so hard. Okay, left. Your left.
All right, you're taking my left?
Yes.
So you are arguing that the biggest obstacle is laziness.
Okay.
Did you get the one you wanted?
Yeah, I did.
All right.
Should I start first?
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's the thing. I would say cowardice is an important obstacle. It's maybe the first thing you have to do, right? Like it's maybe the first step. Like even if you're thinking like allegory of the cave style, like you have to be able to like take that first step out into the light in order to be enlightened, in order to see the world around you, be emancipated. But the emancipation comes from practice, right? Like laziness is the biggest obstacle because becoming emancipated, becoming enlightened is hard work. And if we want to subject our long-standing beliefs to some type of rational analysis or criticism, that takes effort on our part. And like, yes, courage is the first step out of the cave. But I think it takes us actually having to unlearn and relearn over and over again in order to overcome long-standing misbeliefs that we have. So it's hard work and it's continual, it's active. You have to be dedicated to finding truth for yourself, for not succumbing to the laziness of having somebody else find that truth and deliver it to you, or tell you what to think. And so I think laziness is the biggest obstacle because the Enlightenment is lifelong work. It's not just in a moment, and you have to be able to exercise your freedom.
All right, that's a great argument. I am arguing that cowardice is the biggest obstacle. And actually, I love that you brought up the allegory of the cave as the way to think about enlightenment, because you're right. It takes a kind of bravery or a lack of cowardice to make that first step out into the light. But if we are paying attention to Plato's allegory of the cave, enlightenment is not just something that happens in here and in here, right? Because part of the allegory of the cave is coming back to the world and getting strapped back in and taking those things that you know. And what does that person do? They talk to the people around them, right? That they say things that are unpopular. And this leads to them being, like Socrates, persecuted and killed, right? Enlightenment is not enough to just have something internally, but at least Plato, and I think Kant would also say, like, part of living it out is living it out publicly, right? And living it out publicly means you are going to end up saying things which go against the sort of accepted conventions at time, right? Where cowardice comes in to me, I think, is the idea of, if everyone is going one way, you have to choose to go the other way if that's where your reason takes you. And it's hard to step out on your own. It's hard to, and this isn't a one-time thing. This is what it looks like to live it out, is to say, here's what I believe. Here is the convictions of my conscience and my reason, and this is the choice that I'm going to make, even though it may not be popular. I mean, if you think about even American history, right, that there are lots of times and places where people have to make stands about big issues, which, when you look to the people around them, to the broader culture around them, there might be one. So think about something like slavery, right? Slavery is encoded into the American Constitution originally, right? And it takes people who have the who have the bravery to speak out against it, right? To make stands against it. It's one thing to say, in my head, I believe this is wrong. It's another thing to stand up against those things, to stand up against slavery, to stand up against Jim Crow, to stand up against misogyny, things like this in culture, right? So I think that's the harder thing. I think the laziness of doing the work of coming to your own answers is one thing, overcoming that, but the lack of cowardice, the bravery to stand up and actually live out and say what you feel publicly, I think is the thing that matters if we're living in a society, which I think Kant is assuming we do, and I think we're assuming that we do. So I would say cowardice is actually, maybe I'm just saying this because I am myself too much of a coward, but I think that's the bigger one to overcome. Students, those are our thoughts, but let us know your thoughts. Go on to the poll on Moodle and vote to see who you think won each one of these debates. Which side do you find yourself on? That is all the time that we have for this segment. We'll be back in a few seconds to wrap up the show.
Welcome back. It's happy time for July 25th. Happy birthday to Estelle Getty. The American actress was born on this day in 1923. Sam, Getty is probably most famous for playing Sophia on the 1980s sitcom Golden Girls. Why should students go back and watch Golden Girls?
For some reason, I've written a lot of questions for myself about old TV. This show from the 1980s, I started rewatching this about 6 months ago. It's on Hulu, I think, or something like that. And I watch a lot of things like this for nostalgia, things that I watched as a kid. This show is genuinely funny. Where other things I feel like are nostalgically funny, this show is genuinely funny. It has really great DNA going backwards. So the creator of the show, Susan Harris, and one of the producers, Paul Younger, created the show Soap in the late 70s, early 80s, which is a forerunner to a lot of more serialized situation comedies. And one of the writers in the later years on the Golden Girls is Mitch Hurwitz, who is the creator of Arrested Development. So it also has DNA going forward. Really, really, truly funny show. Highly recommend if you're looking for an 80s sitcom to watch. You can do a lot worse than the Golden Girls. Happy anniversary to Emperor Constantine. On this day in 306 AD, Constantine was proclaimed Roman emperor by his troops. Annie, if you were to make a movie about the reign of Constantine, who would you cast as the emperor?
Okay, stick with me on this. My gut reaction was Andrew Garfield.
Oh.
Why? Because what I would want is not just a movie, but like a musical, like Hamilton style, Lin-Manuel Miranda. Andrew Garfield has been in musicals before, and he's kind of got like the gravitas of like an emperor. I feel like he could be like a young Constantine. Don't you think?
He's British, so that helps because of course our Romans all have to be British anyhow.
Yes.
I think this so in this musical, is Constantine a problematic figure, or is he just the heroic figure? Because historically he's problematic and tricky when you think about like his relationship to Christianity, and how do we think about that?
I would say problematic, but I think that Andrew Garfield is just such a charming person that it would be really hard for me to like be sold on him being like a bad guy. So I feel like
I just think a gray area
criticisms. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. I can't wait to, you don't have to answer this, but like who plays Saint Anthony?
Right.
There's all kinds of interesting things here. Yeah.
Happy trails to traditional American folk music. On this day at the Newport Folk Festival, Bob Dylan famously went electric, signaling a major change in folk and rock music. Sam, you are a huge Dylan fan. Do you prefer his pre-electric folk music or his electric rock music?
Well, I will say, if you're interested in this, Martin Scorsese did a great 2-part documentary called No Direction Home about the early years of Dylan, and it the first episode pivots on the 64 Newport Folk Festival, and then the second episode is all about him going electric. It's great. I'm really torn by this question. I think I'm gonna say the early Dylan, even though I mean, Highway 61 Revisited is one of the great albums of all time, but I like the early Dylan because I'm also like a big Pete Seeger fan and a big fan of actual American folk music. So I think albums like The Times They Are Changing, Free Will, and Bob Dylan are top to bottom such good records that I'll say that, but don't hold me to it. Students, that is all the time that we have. Remember to complete your last Poodle video for tomorrow. Let us know about your history and relationship with thinking about faith and science and tensions that you may or may not feel with that. We'll be back towards the end of next week for our last webisode leading into the third exam. Say goodnight, Stacy.